So I got done with Thor Love and Thunder, and I was pleasantly surprised because I came in thinking I would hate this entirely. Especially listening to the non-spoiler reviews, I was like, ooh, this sounds brutal. But I am happy to report most of the movie was very satisfying. It does, of course, have issues, as you would expect from a Marvel movie, and that's probably the low and high point of this is it is a very typical Marvel movie. If you do like that MCU style where it just gives you a fun, silly action film, you will enjoy this and you will like most of it. The low points were kind of low, but I thought for the most part it was fairly strong in terms of the comedy. The romance was a little mixed, but I thought the drama and emotional beats for the most part made sense. So let's get to a more detailed but not spoiler and investigation. So what is occurring? Well, essentially three things. One is that Thor has some adventures with Guardians of the Galaxy. If you were counting on that adventure to be long term, it's not. They're not a cameo, but they're only together about maybe 10 minutes. It's pretty fun stuff, but it's not a long term thing in the movie. The other stories are Gore becoming a kind of god killer and going after the gods, and that's kind of rushed, but I still thought that was very believable. And Christian Bale probably is the strongest part of this movie. He was very attractive, electrifying. The reasoning why Gore is the way he is make a whole lot of sense, and I thought a lot of the turns don't make sense at first, but the more I thought about it and thinking through the scenes, it actually was very credible. So he was probably the strongest point of the entire film. I wish we spent more time with him and developed him a lot more, but it is what it is. And then, of course, we come to the Lady Thor, Natalie Portman becoming Mighty Thor. I was more okay with this than I thought I would be. It's very rushed. Essentially, she's sick and she becomes Thor, but there's a price to be paid, and they lay that out. It wasn't that great. It is a little bit all over the place. I don't find her credible as a fighter, so those were a little rocky, but overall, the special effects were fine. The jokes and banter between them are good. I did think it was a little weak when they tried to make up the gap of how they broke up. There's really only one little part of that sequence I found really, really funny. A lot of it was very generic. And again, that is where Love and Thunder will split people. If you do like Taika Waititi style with Ragnarok, you will probably like this a lot. He promised this would be more crazy, but I actually think this was fairly restrained. In comparison to Ragnarok, which I found really unbearable, except for a few scenes, and the finale, which I thought was strong, this struck me as him being somewhat restrained. It actually reminded me a lot of Jojo Rabbit, which I liked for the most part, but there were moments I thought he went way too far and it could have been more restrained. So, as crazy as it sounds, for me, Love and Thunder is kind of a midway point between Ragnarok and Jojo Rabbit. So, for the most part, I found it pretty good. I did think it was tolerable. I wouldn't say it's my favorite MCU film. I don't think it's a great film. It's not there with the top tier films like Multiverse of Madness or the first Iron Man or the first Captain America. You know, the films that had a really strong auteur style and seemed to be telling their own unique story, but then fit into the larger MCU kind of structure. This seems like a pretty good film. It does have a few of his auteur touches, but it does feel very much like a standard MCU film from phase 2 to 3. If that's what you liked, kind of an Ant-Man story that doesn't really mean anything, it's just here's a story about the super guy. He has some family troubles. He has some dilemma he has to overcome. He has to beat up this baddie guy. That's what this is. But the Christian Bale performance really does a lot for this film. He's extremely magnetic, electrifying, and compelling, especially when you know the full story. And the way he develops and progresses, I thought, was very credible. I wish the only thing I had an issue with was the transformation from him being ordinary to Gore was a little weak. It just didn't feel that special, but emotively and acting wise, I did find it very compelling. And things I thought were cringe at first, like Stormbreaker and the Hammer having a kind of weird rivalry, was a little silly at times, but I thought overall it made sense. So a lot of things that I thought were going to be really, really cringy and stupid actually worked out for the most part. There are a lot of jokes that didn't work for me, especially the Russell Crowe Zeus stuff felt a little overboard, but again, it's what it is. That's the style. And a lot of little neat touches like this. One time we see a kind of ice cream shop that's shaped after Thanos, which might be a little bad taste, but again, that's the whole point of this movie. It does some outrageous things. But I found this much more tolerable than Ragnarok, which I do think actually did character assassination on Thor and Hulk and the Grandmaster. The Grandmaster I consider completely unforgivable. That is just so ridiculously stupid and disgusting. But here it felt modest. It felt like he's doing a mixed style. He is doing some irreverent stuff, but when it came to Eternity and some of the other major cameos, it's much more respectful. And even though a lot of the romance and comedy didn't work for me in places, I did think it was touching towards the end the way that Chris Hemsworth and Natalie Portman related to one another. I don't really believe they are in love. I didn't believe they were in love before. I don't believe they're in love now. But again, for what it was functional to the plot. And surprisingly, Tessa Thompson is not in this as much as you'd expect, but when she showed up, she was pretty strong. There's a lot to quibble over and complain about. It does do a lot of destruction towards the world building and the continuity of the MCU. You are going to be asking a lot of questions like, where are the Avengers? Why doesn't Thor call upon them? And things like that. And there's a lot of internal plot holes. There's also a lot of major continuity and editing mistakes. Others have already spotted this. I will spot more of them, I'm sure, when I think it through. So there are a lot of flaws, but overall, was this a fun, enjoyable, silly film? Yes. Were the serious moments undercut by the comedy? No. When it's serious, I think he was very consistent. You want it to be more serious, that's true, but for what it is, I actually think there was more tonal consistency than some people are complaining about. But this is not as good as Multiverse of Madness. It's not as creative even as Black Widow or Eternals, which at least, even when they weren't successful, tried new things. This is a very safe film. So if you like Taika Waititi style, you're gonna get that, and it's gonna stick to a certain boundary within the. For what it is, it's a strong middling film, and I'm gonna give it a 7.15, 7.35. It's in within that range. So maybe 7.25 is the real score. I don't know. It's somewhere there. It does have a lot of weak moments, but it's not horrible. It's not terrible. It's just above average, but kind of forgettable. But I wouldn't mind seeing this again. Whereas with Ragnarok, I don't ever want to see that again. I really don't. I can see small clips, but I don't want to see the whole thing. If your budget is low and you have to mind your money, you could wait for this on DVD or rent it. It's not critical to understanding the MCU.